Imagine for a second that you are, reading a tense, high-stakes thriller. You're just completely invested.
Oh, totally. On the edge of your seat.
Right. You've been following your favorite character through this incredibly dramatic arc. And right at the ultimate cliffhanger, like the exact moment they are betrayed by their own blood and sold off to a completely unknown fate, you frantically turn the page to see what happens next.
Because you just have to know.
Exactly. But the author doesn't tell you. Instead, the author completely interrupts the plot, shifts focus to a totally different character, and drops you right into the middle of this seemingly unrelated, deeply messy family drama.
Yeah, it's the ultimate narrative whiplash. Any reader would be left completely hanging, wondering why on earth the storyteller would hit the brakes at the exact moment the tension peaks.
You'd probably wonder if your book was misprinted, right?
Yeah.
And that is precisely what happens in the ancient text we're looking at in today's deep dive.
It really is. It's such a jarring transition.
It is. So we are drawing from a massive stack of scholarly, textual analyses, historical context, and literary critiques today, and we are focusing on Genesis chapters 38, 39, and 40.
Which are some of the most analyzed chapters out there.
Definitely. Our mission today is to explore this deliberate narrative disjunction. We are going to examine how these specific chapters actually act as a vital bridge between a massive moral collapse in Canaan and this surprising moral resilience over in Egypt.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at how the original audiences would have understood it.
Right, and along the way, we are going to bust some major historical misconceptions about these very famous stories.
Okay.
Let's unpack this. We start at the end of Genesis 37. Joseph, the favorite son, has just been thrown into a pit by his brothers and sold into slavery.
Yeah, he's on his way to Egypt.
He is. But Genesis 38 abruptly pivots away from Joseph entirely to tell the story of his brother Judah. Why disrupt the story here?
Well, it feels like an error if you're just reading for plot, But structurally, the scholarly sources point out that this interruption is strategically placed to foreground Judah.
Foregrounding him because of what comes later.
Exactly. Even though Joseph is the main character right now, Judah is the one who will eventually become central to later tribal leadership. And ultimately, he's the ancestral line of King David. So the redactors of these texts had a massive narrative problem to solve.
Wait, let's clarify that term for a second.
Yeah.
When we talk about redactors in this context, we aren't just talking about, like, proofreaders checking spelling, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Think of redactors more like ancient political showrunner.
Political showrunners, I like that.
Yeah, because they were working with centuries of different tribal legends, oral histories, fragmented texts. Their job was to stitch all of those competing traditions together into one cohesive cinematic universe, essentially.
A universe that justifies why Judah's specific lineage ended up being the boss.
Precisely. And to do that, the story shifts us into this early tribal, semi-nomadic society in Canaan, where lineage continuity isn't just, important. It is quite literally a matter of life and death.
Because without an heir, your branch of the family tree is permanently severed.
Right. It's just gone.
Which brings us to Judah's family, and specifically his sons. Judah's oldest son, is married to a woman named Tamar. And then dies suddenly, leaving no children.
And that kicks off the whole crisis.
It does. So, following the customs of the time, the second son, Onan, is supposed to step up and provide an heir for Tamar on behalf of his dead brother. But Onan refuses to follow through.
He does.
And this is where one of the biggest misconceptions pops up, because people historically view Onan's actions and his subsequent punishment by God as a story about sexual deviance. But our scholarly sources completely flip that on its head, don't they?
They do. And we really have to look outside the biblical text to fully grasp this. We have to look at comparative historical contexts, specifically things like the Nutsi tablets.
What exactly are the Nutsi tablets? I don't think everyone's familiar with those.
Sure. So they are thousands of ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets discovered in modern-day Iraq, dating back to around the 15th century BCE.
Wow, so thousands of them.
Yeah, a massive find. They are basically the legal and administrative archives of an ancient community, and they blew the lid off our understanding of patriarchal law.
How so?
Well, they detail these complex surrogate and inheritance practices, showing us that these levirate marriage customs, where a brother provides an heir for a deceased sibling, were incredibly common.
It was basically the only social safety net a widow had.
Exactly. So looking through that historical lens, Onan's quote-unquote sin wasn't about sexual misconduct at all. It was calculated economic resistance.
Economic resistance. I love looking at it through that lens.
Yeah.
It makes me think of this like a ruthless corporate maneuver.
Well, a corporate maneuver? How do you mean?
Well, it's like a major stakeholder intentionally withholding a vital asset just to maximize their own equity. Onan is basically looking at the family cap table, realizing his financial shares are going to get massively diluted if he successfully gives Tamar a child.
Because that child would legally inherit Earl's double portion of the estate.
Right, so Onan decides to just sabotage the deal from the inside, which is a completely different vibe than a purely moral failing. But does that mean early readers would have viewed Onan's punishment purely as a business dispute gone wrong?
The cap table analogy works for the math of it, definitely. But we have to be careful not to make Onan sound like a 21st century Wall Street broker.
Fair point, yeah.
For an early Israelite audience, economics and family duty were inseparable from spiritual duty. In the ancient Near East, your bloodline was your literal afterlife.
So it's much heavier than just losing some property.
Exactly. Refusing a familial obligation to preserve a dead brother's line was seen as deeply destabilizing to the entire community. It was economic sabotage, yes, but it was also a profound spiritual sabotage.
And the text leaves the exact mechanics of the divine punishment. Pretty ambiguous, right? And Onan just simply die.
Right, the text doesn't dwell on the how, but the result is that Judah is now terrified. He has lost 2 sons, and he fears losing his third, Shelah.
So he sends Tamar away. He promises she can marry Shelah when he grows up, but Judah has zero intention of actually keeping that promise.
None at all. He is paralyzed by his own survival anxiety.
Which leaves Tamar completely stranded. She's a widow, she has no children, she's tied to a family that refuses to provide for her, and she's legally trapped.
She's in an impossible situation.
Since Onan withheld the heir and Judah is actively failing to protect her, Tamar's vulnerability isn't just sadness, it's an existential threat. She is facing starvation and total erasure.
And this sets the stage for Tamar taking matters into her own hands.
Yeah, she realizes Judah is lying to her. So she uses the system's own rules to secure her survival. She disguises herself as a prostitute, tricks Judah into sleeping with her, and secures an heir herself.
What's fascinating here is how modern scholarship approaches Tamar's actions.
Because historically, she gets a really bad rap, right?
She does. For a long time, there was this heavy bias that framed Tamar as an immoral character acting out of sheer desperation, or even deviance. But the sociologists and literary critics we're looking at today dispel that myth entirely.
How do they frame it?
The text actually frames her as acting within an accepted, albeit extreme, social logic for lineage preservation. When the patriarch of the family fails to uphold the law, she aggressively secures the future of the family herself.
And she is incredibly smart about it. She doesn't just trick him. She demands collateral. She takes his signet ring, his cord, and his staff.
Which is huge.
Yeah. In the ancient world, taking those things is essentially the equivalent of taking someone's ID, their credit cards, and their smartphone. It is undeniable proof of identity.
It really is. And 3 months later, when she is visibly pregnant, Judah is ready to have her executed for immorality.
And then she just casually produces his things.
And that moment of exposure is arguably the core of the entire chapter. The sources highlight this brilliant literary motif of recognition.
If the motif is recognition, didn't that happen earlier? Back in Genesis 37, Judah and his brothers take Joseph's blood-soaked coat back to their father Jacob to fake Joseph's death. Didn't they say something like, recognize this?
They absolutely did. They used the exact same word, hakar. They weaponized recognition to hide their guilt and deceive their father.
That is wild. So the redactors are literally using the exact same phrase to show karma in action.
Exact.
Tamar sends Judah's own seal, cord, and staff back to him with the message, recognize these. It's a total narrative trap using his own previous tactics against him.
Exactly right. It is a stunning narrative reversal. The deceiver is completely deceived, and his moral failure is exposed in front of everyone.
He has no way out.
None. Judah is forced to look at his own items and publicly declare, she is more righteous than I. By exposing his hypocrisy, she literally saves the future of the tribe. Her offspring, Perez, becomes the crucial link in the Israelite identity.
Reading the sociological and feminist scholarly interpretations in our notes, I have to ask, is Tamar's act subversive resistance against a fundamentally broken system, or is she just aggressively complying with patriarchal structures because it's literally her only option for survival?
That's a great question. The scholarly consensus leans toward a complex mix of both. avoiding easy categorization.
Those are not black and white.
Not at all. She is deeply marginalized. The patriarchal system is heavily rigged against her, but feminist interpretations read her as a figure of immense agency.
Right.
She doesn't dismantle the system, because structurally she can't, but she masters its rules so thoroughly that she forces the patriarch to submit to his own laws.
So Judah's house is functionally bankrupt, morally and structurally. Tamar exposed that the patriarchs can't even govern their own families without resorting to deception and failing their basic duties.
They are completely failing.
Right, so where does a tribe go when their internal system collapses? They're forced to rely on external systems. Which brings us exactly to where Joseph has been rotting this whole time, down in Egypt.
That is the pivotal transition. Genesis 38 exposes the internal rot of the covenant family, proving they cannot survive on their own merit right now.
So the narrative has to shift.
Yes. Genesis 39 relocates us to a place where survival can actually take shape, even if it's in a foreign empire. As we jump back to Joseph, who is now a slave in Potiphar's house, the text introduces a vital, repeating phrase. YHWH was with Joseph.
Which is a huge theological framing for the concept of the diaspora, the idea of a people scattered outside their homeland. It establishes that divine presence isn't restricted to a specific zip code in Canaan. God is active down in Egypt in the messy reality of slavery.
And Joseph desperately needs that presence because his life becomes an intense pattern of reversals.
Up and down.
Exactly. He goes from being a slave to becoming the most trusted administrator in Potiphar's household. He rises to the very top, only to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into the dungeon. The sources point out the sexual politics of Potiphar's household here, which provide a fascinating foil to Tamar.
Right, because Potiphar's wife is exercising power within very tightly constrained gender roles, much like Tamar had to, but the application is totally different.
She is a woman of high status but limited direct authority, so she wields the only power she does have sexual leverage over a vulnerable foreign slave.
And Joseph's refusal of her advances is framed hierarchically. He emphasizes how much trust Potiphar has placed in him.
Yes, but despite his integrity, he is undone by a recurring motif in his life. The garment.
His coat. It's like a recurring physical prop in a play that the director keeps weaponizing to strip away Joseph's current identity. Back in Canaan, his brothers strip him of his special robe to fake his death. Now in Egypt, he leaves his cloak behind while fleeing Potiphar's wife, and she uses it as physical false evidence to frame him.
I frame it slightly differently than a prop, actually.
Oh yeah, how so?
His garment is more like a military uniform. The moment it gets stripped off him, whether by his brothers in the pit or Potiphar's wife in the house, he is instantly demoted back to the very bottom of the hierarchy.
So it's tied directly to his status.
It doesn't just symbolize his identity, it dictates his literal safety.
Yeah.
Stripped of his uniform and his hard-earned administrative status, Joseph is cast down into the Egyptian prison system in Genesis 40.
So we're in the prison economy now, and we really need to understand what an Egyptian prison actually was, because it wasn't just a concrete cell block, was it?
Not at all. Egyptian prisons in this era weren't like modern penitentiaries. They were often forced labor camps, or, in this case, a political holding center for the elite who had fallen out of favor with Pharaoh.
Ah, so a different class of prisoners.
Right. And crucially, they had their own internal economies. There was a ledger system, a hierarchy of inmates, rationing, and administration. The text tells us the prison warden basically hands the keys to Joseph.
Just puts him in charge.
Yeah, Joseph takes the administrative skills he learned in Potiphar's house and applies them to surviving the prison economy.
He's running the prison from the inside. And it's in this political holding center that Genesis 40 introduces the dream motif. Two of Pharaoh's disgraced officials, the cupbearer and the baker, are in prison with Joseph, and they both have disturbing dreams.
Right.
Joseph interprets them, and the outcomes are perfectly parallel but totally opposite. The cupbearer gets his job back, and the baker gets executed.
But we need to understand why interpreting these dreams mattered so much. In ancient Egyptian culture, dreams weren't just subconscious processing of your day.
What were they seen as?
They were viewed as state secrets. They were diplomatic cables from the gods.
Oh, wow. So interpreting them wasn't just a neat party trick.
Exactly. Interpreting dreams was a highly classified political job, usually reserved for the most elite, highly trained priests in Pharaoh's court. By successfully interpreting these state secrets, Joseph is bypassing the entire Egyptian credential system.
Wow, that's incredibly dangerous, but also brilliant.
Yes, and this dual outcome, one lives, one dies, exactly as Joseph predicted, establishes his absolute reliability. But Genesis 40 ends in this deep, agonizing narrative irony.
Because he asks for help.
Yeah, Joseph successfully helps the cupbearer and asks for just one thing, to be remembered and advocated for when the cupbearer gets his cushy job back. But the chapter ends by telling us the cupbearer completely forgot him.
2 full years go by. Joseph does everything right. He uses his administrative skills. He interprets the state secrets flawlessly, and he is still left rotting in a political labor camp.
It's brutal.
It is. And this brings up a fantastic point from the scholarly sources tackling another major myth. We often get this Sunday school version of Joseph as this purely moral hero who does the right thing and gets magically rewarded by God.
Yeah, that's a very common reading.
But the textual analysis says it's much more gritty than that. It's less about moral perfection and more about hidden providence. The divine action here is entirely indirect. It is deeply embedded within harsh human circumstance.
It resists easy moralizing. Joseph's integrity lands him in prison, and his prophetic accuracy gets him forgotten.
Here's where it gets really interesting, looking at this critical scholarly question. Does Joseph's eventual success reflect his own merit and adaptability? Is it direct divine intervention? Or is it just careful narrative construction by those redactors trying to explain the reality of the diaspora to an exiled people?
This raises an important question, and that tension is what scholars debate endlessly. The theological and philosophical insights from the text point to a brilliant interplay between human agency and divine sovereignty. It's not an either-or scenario. Human actions, whether it's deception, resistance, economic sabotage, or integrity, are the engine. They drive the events forward.
The people are doing the work.
Right. Tamar's cunning, Judah's cowardice, Joseph's administrative brilliance in the prison economy, the cupbearer's forgetfulness. These are very human, very messy actions.
Yeah.
Yet the text argues that these outcomes continually align with a broader narrative direction. The divine favor isn't a magic wand that teleports Joseph out of the dungeon. It's the hidden providence that allows him to build the skills to survive and eventually thrive within that oppressive foreign structure.
It's a masterclass in survival under foreign power. For an early Israelite audience, reading this while maybe facing their own exile or displacement, Joseph becomes the ultimate model. He proves that you can navigate the systems of an empire without losing your identity.
The intention of those redactors weaving Genesis 38, 39, and 40 together is to create a narrative pedagogy.
To teach them something.
Exactly. They are teaching their audience that leadership and preservation emerge not from moral perfection or pristine conditions, but through transformation, suffering, and survival. Judah had to be confronted with his own massive failure by Tamar to be transformed. Joseph had to endure the stripping of his garments, false accusations, and the brutal reality of a political prison to learn how to preserve his people.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've journeyed from this intense Canaanite family dysfunction and economic sabotage to the harsh reality of the Egyptian prison economy. We started with a cliffhanger interruption that felt like a mistake, but now we see that Genesis 38, 39, and 40 form this incredibly tight, carefully constructed unit.
It's brilliantly put together.
It really is. It juxtaposes internal moral collapse with external preservation. And honestly, these sources remind us of something incredibly grounding. Progress and leadership rarely come from pristine, morally perfect situations.
The text completely resists moral simplification. It presents a world where justice has to be aggressively negotiated, where identity is incredibly unstable, symbolized by veils and stripped military uniforms, and where the future is carried forward through ambiguity, not clarity.
It's just so messy.
The lineage progresses through deeply flawed individuals making the best of impossible situations.
Like Judah making terrible economic choices to protect his wealth, or Tamar having to master the patriarchy's rules to get what she is legally owed, or Joseph running the ledger of a political prison just to stay alive. It's messy. It's human. Which leads me to a final thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Think back to that opening idea of the author interrupting the polished thriller you were reading to show you the ugly family drama underneath. If the foundational origins of a major historical people are built on deception, economic maneuvering, bypassed credentials, and sheer survival rather than clear-cut morality, how might that change the way you evaluate the polished, pristine origin stories of the modern institutions, companies, or leaders you interact with today?